I bought my parents a $380,000 mountain lodge. Came back early from a business trip to find my sister trying to steal it. Her husband was yelling, "This is my house now, old man." Then I walked in. I never thought the best gift I ever gave would turn into my worst nightmare. But life has a twisted sense of humor. My name's Oliver. I'm 32, and 8 months ago my software company went public, and suddenly I had more money than I knew what to do with. Growing up, we didn't have much. Dad worked as a mechanic for 30 years, coming home every night with grease under his nails and a back that ached so bad he could barely stand straight. Mom taught second grade at the local elementary school, spending her own paycheck on supplies because the district budget was a joke. They sacrificed everything for me and my sister Laura, and when that IPO check hit my account, my first thought wasn't about cars or vacations. I thought about them, about their 50th wedding anniversary coming up, about how they deserved something incredible. My buddy Chris is a real estate agent in Colorado, and when I told him what I wanted, he found this stunning mountain lodge in Aspen. For bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rockies, 20 minutes from the ski slopes, with a stone fireplace that could heat half the state. It cost $380,000, and I didn't blink. The deal closed 2 months before their anniversary. The anniversary party was perfect. We rented out this nice restaurant, family and friends everywhere, and when I stood up to make my speech, I could barely get the words out. I handed Dad the envelope with the deed inside, and when he opened it and saw what it was, he just stared at it like he couldn't process the information. Mom started crying immediately, happy tears streaming down her face. Everyone clapped and cheered, and for that one moment, everything felt perfect. My sister Laura was there with her husband Brent and their 2 kids, Justin, who's 6, and Sophie, who's 4. Laura hugged me and told me how amazing it was, but something in her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't think much of it at the time. Brent shook my hand a bit too hard and made some comment about having that kind of money to throw around, with this weird edge to his voice, but I brushed it off. The party went late into the night, and Mom and Dad couldn't stop talking about the lodge. The first 2 weeks after the party were great. Mom called me every other day with updates about the lodge, about the hiking trails they'd discovered, about the neighbor who brought over homemade jam. Dad sent me photos of the sunset from the back deck. These gorgeous shots with the mountains turning purple and gold. I felt this deep satisfaction knowing I'd given them something meaningful. Then Laura started visiting them at the lodge. At first it seemed innocent enough, just family wanting to see the new place. She brought the kids up for a weekend, posted a bunch of photos on social media with captions about family time in paradise. Mom mentioned that Laura seemed really taken with the place, that she kept talking about how peaceful it was, how the mountain air was good for the kids. I didn't think anything of it. Laura had always been dramatic, always chasing the next shiny thing, but I never thought she'd cross the line from admiration to entitlement. 3 weeks after the anniversary, Laura showed up at the lodge with Brent and the kids, all their suitcases packed. She told Mom and Dad this heartbreaking story about how Brent had lost his job, how they were 2 months behind on their mortgage, how the bank was threatening foreclosure. She cried and begged, asking if they could stay at the lodge just for a little while until they got back on their feet. Mom and Dad, being the kind people they are, immediately said yes. How could they turn away their own daughter and grandkids? Laura promised it would only be 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. My parents didn't even tell me about this arrangement at first. When Mom finally mentioned it casually during a phone call, I felt uneasy but didn't want to be the bad guy. I told her to just make sure they were actually looking for work. Mom assured me everything was fine, that Laura was already applying to jobs, that Brent had interviews lined up. Right around this time, I had to leave for a business trip. We were finalizing a huge contract with a client in Seattle, and I needed to be there in person for a month of meetings and negotiations. Emma, my wife, stayed home because of her work, and I flew out thinking everything was under control. I called Mom and Dad every few days from Seattle, and the conversations got progressively weirder. Mom's voice sounded strained, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Dad barely spoke, just gave one-word answers. When I asked about Laura, there was always this long pause before Mom would say everything was fine in this fake, cheerful voice that made my stomach hurt. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I was stuck in Seattle with back-to-back meetings and a contract worth millions hanging in the balance. I thought about flying home early, but every time I brought it up, Mom insisted everything was okay. The deal closed 3 days early, which meant I could fly home a week ahead of schedule. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back early, just booked the flight and decided to surprise my parents at the lodge. I rented a car at the airport and drove straight up to Aspen. When I pulled up the driveway, I immediately noticed that Mom and Dad's car wasn't there. Just Laura's SUV and Brent's beat-up truck. I walked up to the front door and heard shouting from inside. Loud, angry voices that made me freeze with my hand on the doorknob. I opened the door, and the scene inside made my blood run cold. Mom was sitting on the couch crying, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Dad stood near the fireplace, his whole body trembling like he might collapse any second. Laura stood in the middle of the room with her arms crossed, her face red with anger, screaming about how the house should be hers. She was going on about how Mom and Dad didn't even need it, how they had their old house, how she and Brent were young and starting their lives and needed this more. Brent leaned against the kitchen counter with this smug expression on his face, casually telling my parents to just sign it over, to make it easy on everyone. He had the nerve to bring up the grandkids, asking if Mom and Dad wanted to see Justin and Sophie grow up, like he was holding them hostage. Mom looked up with tears streaming down her face and tried to explain that this was my gift, that they couldn't just take it. Laura cut her off, screaming that I had everything, that I didn't care about them, that if I did I wouldn't have left them alone with her for a month. Dad tried to speak, but his voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. Brent pushed off the counter and walked toward my father with this threatening energy. Sophie was crying in the corner, scared by all the yelling, and Justin sat on the stairs with his hands over his ears trying to block it all out. That's when I stepped fully into the room and asked what the hell was going on. My voice came out loud and sharp, cutting through all the noise. Everyone froze. Laura's face went from angry red to pale white in about 2 seconds. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mom jumped up from the couch and ran to me, grabbing my arms and sobbing that she was so glad I was there, that they didn't know what to do, that Laura wouldn't leave and wanted them to give her the house. Dad came over too, his hands still shaking, whispering that this had been going on for days, that they'd told her no, but she just kept pushing. I looked at Laura and asked her slowly if she really wanted Mom and Dad to give her a $380,000 house, the house I bought for them, for their anniversary. Laura's face twisted and she started going off about how I didn't understand, how they were desperate, how Brent couldn't find work and they were going to lose everything. Brent stepped forward and said, "Yeah, and you're sitting on millions while your own sister suffers. What kind of family does that?" These people had been torturing my parents for days, trying to manipulate them into handing over my gift. And they had the nerve to act like I was the villain. The silence after Brent's accusation was deafening. I stood there looking at my sister and her husband, and I felt this cold fury settle over me. I told them very calmly that they had exactly 1 hour to pack their things and get out, or I'd call the police and have them removed for harassment and trespassing. Laura's eyes went wide and she started sputtering about how I couldn't do that, how this was family business, how I was being cruel. Brent took a step toward me like he was going to get physical, and I pulled out my phone and started dialing. That stopped him cold. Mom collapsed back onto the couch, crying with what looked like relief, and Dad put his hand on my shoulder with this grip that told me everything about how scared he'd been. Laura and Brent stormed upstairs to the guest room, and I could hear them arguing in harsh whispers about what to do next. While they packed, I sat down with Mom and Dad and asked them to tell me everything from the beginning. What came out was so much worse than I'd imagined. Mom explained that the first week Laura stayed at the lodge had been fine, almost normal. Laura and Brent acted grateful, helped with dishes, played with the kids in the yard. But then week 2 hit, and things started changing. Laura began making comments about how much space the lodge had, how it was really too big for just 2 people, how Mom and Dad's old house was perfectly adequate for retirement. Brent started having these serious conversations with Dad about financial responsibility and legacy, about how assets should be distributed based on need rather than sentiment. Mom mentioned that Brent had started placing bets on sports games on his phone, always checking scores and odds. They were laying groundwork, building a narrative. Dad said he shut it down immediately, told them the lodge was staying in his and Mom's name, and that was final. That's when things turned ugly. Laura started crying every day, these dramatic sobbing sessions about how unfair life was, how I had everything handed to me while she struggled. She conveniently forgot that she dropped out of college to backpack through Europe on Mom and Dad's dime, that she'd had just as many opportunities as I did. She told Mom and Dad that Brent's job loss wasn't his fault, that they were about to be homeless with 2 small children. She showed them foreclosure notices that I'm pretty sure were fake. She said their landlord was threatening to evict them, that family was supposed to help family in times of crisis. Mom's voice broke when she told me this part. She said they offered to help with rent, to loan Laura and Brent money for a new apartment, but Laura insisted that wasn't enough. She wanted the lodge. She said it was the only solution that made sense, that Mom and Dad were being selfish. When Mom and Dad refused, Laura started bringing the kids into it. She'd have Justin and Sophie tell their grandparents how much they loved the lodge, how happy they were there, how they didn't want to leave. She coached those little kids to guilt trip their own grandparents, which is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard. Brent started getting aggressive with Dad, standing too close, raising his voice, making veiled threats about family loyalty. He told Dad that if they really cared about their grandkids, they'd do whatever it took to keep them safe and stable. He implied that if Mom and Dad didn't sign over the lodge, they might not see Justin and Sophie anymore. That's when Mom started getting physically sick from the stress. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, spent hours crying while Laura berated her. Dad tried to call me multiple times, but Laura always seemed to be hovering nearby, and she'd convinced them that telling me would ruin my important business deal in Seattle. The worst part came 3 days before I showed up. Laura told Mom and Dad that she'd spoken to a lawyer, that legally they could claim the lodge was a family asset since they'd been living there for weeks and had established residency. She said if Mom and Dad tried to kick them out, she'd sue for grandparents' rights and they'd never see the kids again. Brent backed her up, said they had rights, said they'd make this as difficult and expensive as possible if Mom and Dad didn't just cooperate. He told Dad that at their age, did they really want to spend their retirement in court battles and family feuds? Mom said that's when Dad started trembling, when the stress became physical. He's 72 years old, and his daughter was threatening to destroy the family if she didn't get her way. They felt trapped, helpless, terrified of losing their grandchildren, but also knowing they couldn't just hand over my gift. I sat there listening to all of this and felt sick to my stomach. This was my sister, someone I'd grown up with, and she'd turned into this manipulative person who was willing to torture our elderly parents to get what she wanted. I asked Mom why they didn't just call me anyway, business deal or not, and she started crying again. She said Laura had convinced them I'd be angry, that I'd think they were weak, that I'd blame them for letting things get this bad. I pulled her into a hug and told her none of this was her fault, that Laura was the one who should be ashamed, that I was so sorry I hadn't been there to protect them. Dad sat there with tears running down his face, looking older than I'd ever seen him, and I realized my sister hadn't just tried to steal a house. She'd destroyed their sense of safety in a place that was supposed to be their sanctuary. When Laura and Brent finally came down with their suitcases, Laura tried one more manipulation. She had Sophie in her arms and Justin holding her hand, and she looked at Mom with these sad eyes. "I guess we'll be living in our car now," she said, her voice trembling. "I hope you can live with yourselves knowing your grandchildren will be homeless." Brent stood behind her nodding, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. While they'd been packing, I made a quick call to their landlord, a number I'd gotten from Mom's phone contacts. I stood up and walked toward them, and my voice came out cold. "You're not homeless, Laura. I just spoke to your landlord. You're 1 month behind on rent, not facing foreclosure, not being evicted." Her face went white. She hadn't expected that. The foreclosure notices were complete fiction. I told her I knew she was lying, that I knew exactly how much debt she really had, and that if she ever came near Mom and Dad again with these manipulations, I'd make sure everyone in the family knew exactly what kind of person she really was. Laura's mask finally cracked completely. She started screaming about how I'd always been the favorite, how Mom and Dad loved me more, how nothing she did was ever good enough. She called me spoiled and entitled, said my success was just luck and I didn't deserve any of it. Brent tried to pull her toward the door, but she was on a roll now, years of jealousy and resentment pouring out. She said I'd ruined her life by being the perfect son, that she'd always lived in my shadow, that this lodge should have been hers because she needed it more. The entitlement was breathtaking. I just stood there and let her rant, let her show Mom and Dad exactly who she'd become. When she finally ran out of steam, I opened the front door and told them to leave. "Get out of my parents' house," I said quietly, "and don't come back." They left, Laura crying, Brent glaring at me like I was the villain, the kids confused and upset. I watched their car disappear down the driveway and felt this strange mix of relief and heartbreak. I'd just kicked my own sister out, probably destroyed whatever was left of our relationship, but what choice did I have? Mom and Dad sat on the couch holding hands, looking exhausted but finally safe. But as I closed the door, I had this sinking feeling that this wasn't over, that Laura wasn't the type to just accept defeat and move on. The first few days after Laura left were quiet, almost too quiet. Mom and Dad stayed at the lodge with me, and I took a week off work to make sure they were okay. We didn't talk much about what had happened at first. Mom would start crying randomly throughout the day, and Dad kept apologizing like any of this was his fault. I spent most of my time just being there, making meals, going on walks with them, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. Emma drove up from the city on day 3, and having her there helped. On the 4th night, we all sat by the fireplace, and Dad finally opened up about how scared he'd been. He said he'd never seen Laura like that before, so angry and desperate and willing to hurt people to get what she wanted. Mom admitted she'd been having nightmares about losing the grandkids, about Justin and Sophie growing up thinking their grandparents didn't love them. I promised them that wouldn't happen, that we'd figure this out. 2 weeks after I kicked Laura out, a package arrived at my apartment in the city. Legal documents. My sister was suing me for emotional distress and claiming I'd verbally promised her the lodge. The paperwork was ridiculous, full of lies about how I'd told her the house was meant for the whole family, how I'd encouraged her to move in and then cruelly evicted her. She claimed Mom and Dad had agreed to sign over the property, but I'd manipulated them into changing their minds. She was asking for $300,000 in damages plus ownership of the lodge. I sat there reading this fiction she'd created and my hands started shaking. Brent's influence was all over this. The language, the strategy, the manipulation of facts. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd handled my business contracts, and she read through everything with this expression that went from annoyed to amused. She told me the case was frivolous, that Laura had no legal standing, but that we'd still have to respond and possibly go to court. She warned me it would take time and money. The legal battle stretched out over 10 weeks. Laura filed motion after motion, each one more desperate than the last. She tried to get depositions from Mom and Dad, probably hoping to confuse or intimidate them on record. Patricia shut that down fast. Laura's lawyer tried to subpoena my financial records. The judge denied it. Every attempt Laura made to build a case fell apart under basic scrutiny. But the process was exhausting. I had to miss work for court appearances, spent thousands on legal fees, and watched my sister lie under oath multiple times. She sat on the witness stand and told story after story about how I'd always hated her, how I'd bought the lodge specifically to exclude her, how our parents feared me. It was like watching a stranger. Patricia demolished her on cross-examination, brought up the landlord's testimony about the rent situation, showed text messages where Laura had told friends she was going to get what she deserved from the lodge situation. The judge wasn't impressed. During all of this, Brent disappeared. Literally just vanished one day in the middle of the court proceedings. We found out later he'd gotten into serious trouble with loan sharks over gambling debts nobody knew about. Those sports bets he'd been placing at the lodge weren't just casual gambling. They were feeding a serious addiction. He'd apparently been planning to use the lodge as collateral for more loans to cover his losses. When his creditors started circling, he packed a bag and left Colorado entirely. Laura came home one day to find half their apartment empty and a note saying he had to take care of some things. She tried calling him for days, but his phone was disconnected. That's when she finally started to break. She showed up to court looking destroyed, no makeup, hair unwashed, and her lawyer requested a recess. During that recess, Patricia got a call. Laura wanted to drop the lawsuit. She couldn't afford her attorney anymore without Brent's income, and she was facing the reality of being a single mom with 2 kids and no real job prospects. The lawsuit had been her last desperate attempt to fix her life, and it had failed spectacularly. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning Laura couldn't refile. He also ordered her to pay my legal fees, which came to about $18,000. She didn't have it, obviously, so Patricia set up a payment plan that would take her years to complete. I asked Patricia if we could just waive it, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She tried to steal from your parents and then sue you with lies, she said. But I couldn't do it. I had Emma call Laura's lawyer and tell them we'd forgive the debt if Laura agreed to therapy and stayed away from Mom and Dad for 6 months. Laura agreed immediately. Those 6 months were hard on Mom. She missed the grandkids terribly, would cry looking at photos of Justin and Sophie. Dad was angry, which was rare for him. He felt betrayed in a way that went deeper than the lodge situation. His daughter had threatened him, manipulated him, and then lied in court about it. I convinced them both to try family therapy, found a good counselor who specialized in family trauma. The sessions were brutal at first. Mom kept making excuses for Laura, falling back into old patterns of protecting her. The therapist called her out on it, explained how that enabling had helped create this situation. Dad had to confront his own guilt about favoring Laura when we were kids. I had to work through my anger, my feeling of betrayal, my grief over losing the sister I thought I knew. It took months, but slowly we started healing. 8 months after everything went down, I got an email from Laura. The subject line just said, "I'm sorry," and I almost deleted it without reading. But something made me open it. She wrote that she was in therapy twice a week, working 2 jobs to support herself and the kids. She had primary custody because Brent had officially abandoned them, hadn't sent a single child support payment, or even called to check on Justin and Sophie. She'd moved into a smaller 2-bedroom apartment and was slowly rebuilding her life from scratch. The email was long, probably too long, but I read every word. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to justify what she'd done or blame it all on Brent. She took responsibility. She wrote about how jealousy had poisoned her for years, how she'd watched me succeed and felt like a failure in comparison. She said Brent had fed that resentment and twisted it into entitlement, but she acknowledged that she'd let him because it was easier than admitting her own shortcomings. She was teaching Justin and Sophie about hard work now, about earning things instead of expecting them to be handed over. She'd gotten a job as a server at a diner and was taking online classes to finish her degree. The last paragraph hit me the hardest. She wrote that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, that she knew she didn't deserve it and might never deserve it. She just wanted me to know that she was trying to become a better person, not because she thought it would fix anything, but because her kids deserved a better mom. She said if I never wanted to speak to her again, she'd understand and respect that. But if there was any chance, even a tiny one, that someday we could have a relationship again, she'd wait however long it took. She wanted Justin and Sophie to know their uncle and their grandparents, but only if we were comfortable with it, and only when everyone was ready. She ended the email with, "I destroyed something beautiful because I couldn't stand seeing you happy. I have to live with that every day. I'm so sorry, Oliver." I sat there staring at my laptop screen for probably 20 minutes after I finished reading. Emma came home from work and found me like that, and she read the email over my shoulder. She asked what I was going to do. Part of me was still so angry, still hurt by the betrayal. But another part of me saw my sister in that email, not the monster who'd terrorized our parents, but the girl I'd grown up with who'd always struggled to find her place in the world. I talked to Mom and Dad about it that weekend. Mom wanted to reach out immediately, but Dad was more hesitant. The therapist had warned us about not rushing into reconciliation. We decided to take it slow. I wrote back to Laura a few days later. I kept it short. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I could see she was working on herself. I said I needed more time, and Mom and Dad needed time too. I suggested that maybe in another 6 months we could meet for coffee somewhere neutral, not at the lodge, and just talk. No expectations, no promises, just a conversation. She responded within an hour saying she understood completely, that she'd wait as long as it took, that she was just grateful I'd responded at all. True to her word, she didn't push. She sent occasional updates, brief emails about the kids or her progress in therapy, never asking for anything. It's been 14 months now since everything happened. Last month, I finally met Laura for coffee at a diner halfway between the city and her apartment. It was awkward at first, both of us not knowing what to say. But then Justin and Sophie came running in from where they'd been waiting in her car, and seeing them broke some of the tension. They're good kids, and it's clear Laura is trying hard to give them a stable life. We talked for 2 hours, mostly about the kids and her therapy. We didn't talk much about what happened at the lodge. That conversation will come eventually, but this was a start. When we left, she hugged me and thanked me for giving her a chance. I told her we'd do it again next month, maybe bring Mom and Dad to meet the kids for a supervised visit. I don't know if our relationship will ever be what it was. Maybe too much has been broken. But I'm leaving the door open, just a crack, because that's what family does. Mom and Dad are finally enjoying the lodge the way I'd imagined. They spend most weekends there now, and Dad's been talking about retiring there full-time. Emma and I visit them once a month, and those weekends have become my favorite time. Sitting on that deck watching the sunset, seeing my parents relaxed and happy, knowing they're safe. The most expensive gifts aren't always measured in dollars. Sometimes they cost pieces of your heart and your family and your peace of mind. You give them anyway, hoping they'll grow into something beautiful. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, but you gave them regardless. And maybe that's what matters most. Not the gift itself, but the love behind it and the willingness to protect it when someone tries to take it away. Mom and Dad know I'd do anything for them, and after everything that happened, I think they finally believe it. That might be the real gift I gave them. Not the lodge, but the certainty that someone will always have their back. even when that someone has to stand against family to do it. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.